Hello, Cinemaster lovers. Welcome back. I hope you're ready for an exciting experience because we've got something special for you today. Get comfortable, grab your snacks, and let's dive right into the action. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Let's get started. Humans are searching for another planet to live on due to overpopulation. Thus, they began developing the genetic traits of volunteers and sending them to a strange planet. In the year 2048, the human population had grown significantly, and there was a shortage of natural resources. As a result, the government created a new program to genetically modify 14 volunteers and send them to one of Saturn's moons, Titan, to start a new civilization there. The government relocated the 14 volunteers and their families to a special neighborhood, providing them with luxurious and advanced homes. Rick was one of the volunteers. Rick, a former military pilot, had a family consisting of his doctor wife and their son Lucas. The head of the development program, Dr. Collingwood, had high hopes for the project, especially for Rick, because during his time as an Air Force pilot, his plane crashed in a remote area, and he had to cross the Syrian desert alone while injured, without food or water, for 3 days. This proved his exceptional endurance and adaptability. Rick joined the project for the sake of his wife and son, but Abigail was worried about his health and expressed her concerns to Dr. Collingwood. Collingwood reassured her, acknowledging that Rick might face difficulties, but assured her that they had top-notch doctors who would take great care of him. After all the volunteers moved into their neighborhood, they attended their first meeting with Collingwood to begin the program. Initially, Collingwood gave a presentation about the project, explaining how humans had destroyed Earth and how Titan was the suitable alternative due to its atmosphere and primitive ecosystems. However, the moon was also filled with seas of liquid methane, and its atmosphere was mostly nitrogen, which posed a significant challenge for humans. Additionally, Titan was extremely cold. Hence, the project was created, not to adapt Titan to human conditions, but to adapt humans to Titan's conditions through genetic modification. One of the volunteers interrupted and asked how their bodies would handle genetic mutation. Collingwood explained that initial trials were straightforward, but he couldn't guarantee that everyone would survive the mutation. At that moment, the volunteer raised another question, but Rick silenced him, saying that anyone unwilling to face the risks of the project shouldn't participate. It was revealed that all the volunteers had endured tough and harsh conditions like Rick and had come from all over the world. After the presentation, the volunteers were given the schedules for every part of the base and were then taken to the lab to receive their first dose of the 300 doses they were supposed to take in the coming weeks. Dr. Saraya explained to Rick the purpose of each dose, but Rick couldn't remember half of it. From that point on, Rick's family began their new life, which resembled their usual daily routine. Lucas attended school, Abigail took care of the house, and accompanied Rick to his therapy sessions. Over time, the volunteers became friends, frequently meeting outside the project. Being neighbors, they started hosting parties and spending evenings together. However, their conversations sometimes turned grim. One of them was afraid the government wouldn't bring them back after the agreed-upon time frame. One day, the volunteers threw a party and drank a bit too much since it would be their last chance to drink. Abigail felt sick after drinking, and Rick came to help her upstairs to rest. But as soon as they went upstairs, Rick collapsed and started coughing violently, struggling to breathe. When Abigail touched him, she found his body temperature was extremely high. She quickly took him to the bedroom, laid him on the bed, gave him some medication, and stayed by his side all night. Meanwhile, Collingwood was thrilled by the noticeable developments in the volunteers' genes and decided they were ready for a real test. He asked them to dive into a swimming pool without oxygen tanks and set a timer. Strangely, all the volunteers surfaced except for Rick and a woman named Tally. The two stayed underwater for over half an hour. Rick and Tally turned it into a challenge, but Tally couldn't endure it and surfaced after 39 minutes. Rick, however, was completely at ease underwater, as if he had always lived there. He even moved swiftly, swimming like a dolphin. The other volunteers were amazed by his behavior. That night, Rick showed his son Lucas the new moves he had learned. Afterward, Lucas went to bed, and Rick and his wife Abigail went to the pool to have some fun. Abigail noticed black veins appearing on Rick's body, but they disappeared quickly, so she thought she was imagining it and continued swimming. Days later, the volunteers underwent their first surgical procedure. One of the volunteers' wives, named Ryan, spent an entire day with Abigail. Ryan's children played with Lucas, and as the two women grew comfortable talking to each other, Ryan confessed to Abigail that she was afraid of her husband, feeling like he was no longer human. Abigail reassured her, saying they were doing this for humanity and, more importantly, for their children's future. After the surgery, Rick returned home in good health to spend time with his family. Abigail was thrilled to have him back, but was concerned about the side effects she had read about in the manual they were given. One night, Abigail woke up to find Rick missing from their bed. She found him in the kitchen, applying ice to his neck because he felt an intense heat in his body. Abigail brought a larger bucket of ice, and Rick challenged her to a little game, to place her hand in the ice, with the first to remove their hand losing. Abigail had to take her hand out after a few minutes, while Rick felt nothing at all. The next morning, Abigail and Rick went for a run together and stopped to admire a beautiful view. Rick expressed sadness about Earth, but Abigail reassured him, saying she believed in him. The training continued, with the volunteers testing helmets, simulating Titan's atmosphere, and swimming in freezing water. Some volunteers failed these exercises and struggled, but they were taken away to rest. Tally, however, was extremely stubborn and pushed herself even if it meant freezing to death. Rick taught her how to meditate underwater to extend her endurance. After the pool tests, Rick noticed his hair falling out, and Tally experienced the same. Suddenly, one of the volunteers began screaming, coughing up a lot of blood. They rushed to save her, but couldn't. She became the first fatality among the volunteers. Later that day, the volunteers held a meeting to discuss what had happened to their colleague. Some of them were afraid that this would be their end as well, but the rest told them that they had known the risks before starting. Despite being prohibited from drinking, they decided to drink to forget what had happened. Afterward, Andrew, Tally's husband, was helping Abigail in the kitchen and told her their story and how they met. Then Tally entered and noticed that Andrew had given up on starting a family with her. As soon as Andrew left the kitchen, Tally spoke with Abigail and said she had volunteered for this project to build a better world for herself and Andrew. At dinner, Abigail noticed that all the volunteers' viands turned black for moments before returning to normal. Suddenly, they heard screaming coming from the garden and discovered that Zane, Ryan's husband, had lost control and attacked her. All the men rushed out, restrained Zane, and managed to control him. The next day, Dr. Freya brought new medications for the volunteers to prevent further episodes. Abigail noticed that the doses were much higher than usual and requested to speak with Collingwood, but Freya told her they were busy. That night, Rick was vomiting blood. Abigail came in to clean it up and secretly took a blood sample to analyze. Once, while walking around the house and locking the doors before bed, Abigail noticed cameras installed in the house to monitor her husband 24/7. The second time Rick went into the pool, he noticed his skin peeling but didn't pay much attention to it. However, when he lay next to Abigail, she noticed his skin issue and started worrying about him. The next day, Abigail analyzed Rick's blood under a microscope and found that it was turning black. Later, the volunteers underwent a second procedure, this time on their eyes, to enable night vision like cats. The procedure was successful, but Rick had to cover his eyes with gauze for a while, so his family helped him with daily needs. One night, Abigail heard Rick groaning softly in pain and noticed that his eyes were bleeding. They rushed him to the lab for another procedure. Abigail confronted Collingwood about what was happening to her husband and revealed that she knew about the cameras. Collingwood admitted that he hadn't wanted to install them, but Joan insisted for security reasons. He reassured her about Rick, saying he wouldn't see for a few days but would be fine afterward. However, Abigail was not convinced and felt he was hiding much more. Abigail went home to get some clothes for her husband and heard alarms. She found the military surrounding the area and saw Zane, now transformed, throwing his wife Ryan out of the window, killing her instantly. Soldiers stormed Zane's house and killed him too. After these disasters, Abigail monitored her husband in quarantine. She took advantage of Collingwood's absence, stole his keys, and decided to uncover what he was hiding. Abigail avoided security and reached Collingwood's office, where she found files on all the volunteers. She discovered that they had mixed their DNA with animal DNA to enhance them and turn them into superior beings. Meanwhile, Collingwood was in a meeting with Colonel Solon and a NASA team. They wanted to shut down the project due to the disasters, comparing it to the dangerous genetic experiments by the Nazis. However, Collingwood and his assistant argued that the final decision lay with the Department of Defense and that the project would only end with an official directive. After the meeting, Freya tried to convince Collingwood to end the project, but he refused. Rick was released from quarantine and returned home. Collingwood visited him and said he would regain his vision within a day. He explained that Rick's brain had struggled to adapt to his enhanced senses, but would stabilize after the surgery. At this point, Abigail demanded the whole truth. Collingwood admitted that they were injecting volunteers with animal DNA and that the process was indeed unstable, as she suspected. He added that another procedure was necessary for all volunteers. Angry, Abigail stormed out. The next day, Rick removed the gauze from his eyes, and the procedure was successful. He could see perfectly. He shaved his head to match the bald patches. That night, Rick swam in the pool and was amazed to see every detail in the dark. Overjoyed, he called Collingwood and agreed to undergo the next procedure. The following day, all the volunteers underwent the procedure, but most of them died. Only Rick and Tally survived. The next day, Andrew, Abigail, and Lucas visited Rick and Tally and were shocked to see they had transformed into strange creatures, communicating through touch and low-frequency waves inaudible to humans. Humans communicate using sound waves between 30 and 30,000 hertz. Rick placed his hand on the glass separating them, and Abigail cried for her husband. Things worsened when Collingwood handed her Rick's wedding ring. In the coming days, Rick and Tally were set to move to Titan, but until then, they would stay with their families at home. At home, Rick tried to wear his old clothes but struggled. Abigail tried to help him, but Rick accidentally hit her. When he approached to check on her, Abigail grew afraid and distanced herself. From then on, Rick spent most of his time in the pool, where he felt more comfortable. One night, after putting Lucas to bed, Abigail discovered Tally in their house with blood-stained hands. Rick was unbothered by Tally's appearance, approached her, held her hands, and communicated through touch. At that moment, the military arrived at Tally's house and found Andrew dead in the bathroom. They then entered Rick's house and shot tranquilizer darts at Tally. It took a while, but Tally eventually fell. However, as the soldiers approached her, Tally surprised them and attacked. The remaining soldiers shot her dead. The soldiers then went after Rick, but he killed them easily with his new strength. At that moment, Abigail ran out and saw Rick drowning the last soldier, and Rick fled after he calmed down from his anger and realized what he had done. Colonel Solano assigned other soldiers to search for Rick, ignoring Collingwood's request not to kill him. As for Abigail and Lucas, they were taken to the research base to keep them safe there. Later, Abigail escaped from the base, made sure no one was watching her, and went to her private place with Rick. Indeed, she found Rick there and extended her hand to him in an attempt to connect with him. As soon as Rick held her hand, Abigail suddenly collapsed. At that moment, military helicopters appeared and attacked them. Abigail woke up later at the base and found Collingwood sitting next to her. There, he told her that the project would be shut down, and therefore Rick needed to be sent to Titan as soon as possible. This was because Earth's atmosphere had affected Tally, causing her to kill her husband. The atmosphere might also kill her husband Rick, since it was no longer suitable for him after his transformation. But Rick's strength was immense, and they couldn't control him or force him to go to Titan. That's why they needed Abigail to convince him. After a while, they took her to see Rick, and she was deeply saddened to see her husband trapped in a glass box. There, Collingwood asked Abigail to give Rick an injection to erase his memory, but Abigail refused. Collingwood told her it was the only way to make him agree to go to Titan. Indeed, one of the soldiers brought the injection, but Abigail deliberately dropped it and asked him to bring it again. Afterward, Abigail went to her husband, held his hand, and gave him the injection in his arm. Rick fainted within seconds. Immediately after, Abigail left the place and asked Freya to come with her. At that moment, a soldier approached Rick to prepare him for the journey. But suddenly, Rick woke up and killed the soldier. It was revealed that Abigail had swapped the doses and replaced them with saline solution when she dropped the injection earlier. The soldiers fired at Rick, but he escaped and hid in a dark place, taking advantage of his ability to see in the dark. Meanwhile, Abigail took Lucas and fled with Freya, meeting Rick along the way. Rick was severely injured, and Freya gave him some medicine, but suddenly soldiers surrounded them. Collingwood demanded they leave Rick and run, threatening to shoot them. Abigail, Freya, and Lucas refused to abandon Rick. At that moment, Collingwood became furious and ordered the soldiers to shoot them. But Solano refused, saying he wouldn't fire at 2 women and a small child. He then pointed his gun at Collingwood, and his soldiers did the same, arresting Collingwood. At that moment, Abigail ran to Rick and hugged him. Through her touch, Rick remembered all the happy memories they had shared. Every time she held his hand, she had been able to connect with him. At the end of the film, we see that Abigail and Freya became supervisors of the Titan II project, but this time, they used ethical and humane methods to manage the new project. Rick went to Titan, and we see that his body evolved, developing wings that allowed him to fly in his new home. And that's how our movie ends. If you liked the film, don't forget to like and subscribe to keep up with all the new movies. Goodbye, my friend.